It's fine? Okay. All right. So I just want to remind you that the final exam is a take-home exam. It's not an in-class exam, and you'll have exactly 1 week to write the exam. So the exam will be emailed to you shortly after the end of class on Thursday of week 10, and it will be due back on Thursday of week 11, which is exam week. Okay, and I think I've already explained to you before, so I don't really need to get into that in any detail at this juncture, but the exam will be of the essay variety, and you'll have some choice, and it will cover everything from week 1 until week 10, because we haven't had a midterm. If there had been a midterm, then there might have been perhaps a greater emphasis on the second half of the course. And you should expect questions which will be, on the whole, relatively wide-ranging. You're not going to get a question which is going to ask you about one single text, such as the Nandini Sundar book, which we've been reading for this segment here. You know, you've seen the book before you, The Burning Forest. You're not going to get a question which is going to be just on this book. There may be a question which may have you look at 3 or 4 books. It's obviously, since it's a take-home exam, it's an open book exam, and you can look at any of the readings. You can go back to the lectures, consult outside sources. The instructions will be amply clear to you. All right, and your midterm papers will be returned to you on Tuesday. Okay, any other questions before I begin? So what I propose to do today is take 10, 15, 20 minutes, wrap up my discussion of the Naxalite movement and counterinsurgency in India, and then I want to move to the next segment, which is a segment which is on workers, refugees, migrants, labor history. It's again a very wide-ranging section, but I'm going to try to zero in on a few considerations which I think are important. Before we do that, let me finish up with this. So I've been speaking to you about the state and Naxalism and counterinsurgency. And once again, I want to impress upon you the fact that we are talking about something that is quite unusual, because we are talking about a democracy. At this juncture, it's not very productive to really get into the larger question of to what extent India is a functioning democracy. The same argument can be made apropos of some other democracies, certainly including this one over here, I think. And we've entertained these questions, before, and they're there in the background. They're not unimportant by any stretch of the imagination, because again, if you look at the Sundar argument, she points out that, well, all of this is happening when there is a democracy, at least purportedly what calls itself a democracy, functioning democracy in India. You even have in organizations such as a National Human Rights Commission. There is a National Human Rights Commission. There is a system of courts. The Supreme Court hands down mandates as it does, and very often the state has to follow them. You, of course, have the same problem that you have here, which is going back to the time of Andrew Jackson, the famous saying that the court can, issue an order, but it's the executive that's got to implement it. And so that problem, of course, will persist in India as well. You do have a relatively free press. Journalists have been endangered in India. I think their India is in a situation which I would say is markedly different from, let's say, the U.S., where I wouldn't describe journalists as being under threat. The one reason they don't have to be under threat here is you have an extraordinary system of censorship, because conglomerate media owns virtually everything in this country. I mean, if you come down to it, I mean, there are going to be 4 or 5 corporations that own 95% of American media to begin with. Right? So there are very complex considerations why some countries don't actually need what you might call regimes of censorship which are at the point of the gun. In India, as you saw the clips from Anand Patwardhan's film, and the most recent film, Reason, is partly around a number of Indian intellectuals who have been assassinated. Right? But notwithstanding that, there is a press, right? And to some extent, it's a very free press. So this is why this matter is of grave concern, because what you're really talking about is tantamount to a civil war. This is what you might find in a country that's under a military dictatorship. You might find it in a country, in fact, they argue that democracies don't really have civil wars. Certainly not since maybe the American Civil War, maybe, right? But certainly in the course of the 20th century, that democracies don't really even have civil wars. There may be dissent within a democracy of various kinds, but not a civil war. But this is tantamount to a civil war. It's undeclared civil war between the state and large segments of the population in certain portions of the country. And that is why I have dwelt on this subject, because it's not only because the Naxalite movement points to obvious problems, such as the fact that the state has not really been able to make inroads of the kind that we ideally might want it to make into people's lives, that is, offering certain kinds of social goods, offering a security to the people, a security network in the widest sense, security of employment, security of housing. I don't mean security simply in terms of personal security, right? That the state has not been able to make those kinds of inroads. There are a huge number of people who are outside that security net. And nowhere does one experience this more than in the tribal regions of the country, which constitute a significant percentage of the population of the country, as has been pointed out. Right? So it's for all of these reasons that this becomes a very pressing problem, because you see the problems in a more heightened form. Now, one of the things that I've endeavored to do in this class over the course of the last 7 weeks, and will certainly continue to do it in the course of the next few weeks, is to also point to sometimes comparisons with other democracies such as the US, but I've also tried to put points in an analytical framework sometimes. And I want to begin with one of these points. So there's an anthropologist and a scholar by the name of James Scott, who has made a distinction between state spaces and non-state spaces. Now, this is really a critical distinction, because one of the things that he has argued in his work, he has really an extraordinary body of work, very wide body of work, and I want to reference some more of it than simply what is indicated in this phrase. His early work had to do with everyday forms of resistance. Right? That, when we think of resistance, very often we think of movements, political movements, social movements, ecological movements, widespread movements with constituencies that might extend to certain portions of the country, across classes, so forth and so on. That's very often how we think of resistance. But then there are everyday forms of resistance. Right? I'm going to give you a very dramatic illustration of that. He doesn't. And it has nothing to do with India. And it's meant to shock you, because when I read it, it shocked me, surprised me. So I was reading this book by a feminist scholar when it came out 3 decades ago. Holy Fast, Holy Feast is called. And Carolyn Bynum Walker is her name. And Carolyn Bynum in this book was looking at the lives of young women in Europe in the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century. A large number of them became nuns. Now, you see, if you were a young woman in Europe and you didn't want to get married, because that was what it was expected that every woman would do. You get married, and then you rear children. Or what if you didn't want to get married? What were your life choices at that time for you? And one life choice was you became a nun. That was one choice. Now, another life choice, because she was also interested at that time, 3 decades ago. Every day in the newspapers in the US, I was reading about something which you've all heard of, but you don't hear about it that much now. Anorexia. Huge number of young women becoming anorexic. Right? And what she argues is there's a history of anorexia in a way going back to the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century. Because what she found going through the records was there were lots of young women, if you didn't want to become a nun, so what you did was you made yourself physically unattractive. You became anorexic. You stopped eating. To the point where actually these young women would go into a stage of amenorrhea, that is that they wouldn't even have their periods. Right? So she's looking at this. Now what does she say? She says, but there's another mode of resistance. You know what they would do? Because they found men so oppressive that when they cooked food for them, they would mix in their menstrual blood and serve it to them. This was a way for them to get their revenge. This is resistance. It's not written in any history book. Right? These are forms of everyday resistance. Now, James Scott was talking about everyday forms of resistance. When you're looking at resistance in India, I'm giving you this picture of this Naxalites, but I want you to keep in mind when you read the Neil Mukherjee book, you know, that if you have a maidservant and she's mislaid the spices that she knows the woman of the house really wants in her food. Well, what does this mislaying the spices mean? That this is a form of resistance. This is how you get back at people in power. Right? So this is the segue into from the mega picture into also the section we're going to go into, but now state spaces and non-state spaces. So James Scott's the one who wrote about everyday forms of resistance. That's the name of one of his books. One of his other books is called Domination and the Arts of Resistance. Then he has this book called Seeing Like a State. And this is where this idea of state spaces and non-state spaces is taken from. That every state has an anxiety about non-state spaces. Non-state spaces are spaces that a state has not been able to infiltrate. You know, one of the modern projects of a state was you map out everything. We use the word mapping in a very metaphorical sense often. You know, have you mapped this or that? No, but if you look at it in the cartographic sense, there was this Enlightenment project, which just continues down to the day. You map everything. Every square inch needs to be mapped to the extent that is possible. But there are spaces that you cannot map. You cannot map it because, for example, the territory might be hostile to you. The terrain may be difficult, it may be rugged, it may be hostile because there are people there who are hostile to you, or it may just be difficult of access. The higher up you get into the mountains, 20,000 feet, it's all non-state spaces. It is not an accident, just to switch to this slide here, so you notice here there's a place called FATA. That's the acronym, FATA, Federally Administered Tribal Areas. This is a map of Pakistan. FATA was an autonomous region. We are doing the history of South Asia, so this is straight off from there. FATA was an autonomous region of Pakistan from 1947, when Pakistan was carved out of India, until 2018. Now in 2018, it was absorbed into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which you see on the top over there. So FATA was federally administered tribal area. It was autonomous because the state had not really made too much inroads into it. Why hadn't they made inroads into it? Because it was hostile territory. It's what James Scott calls a non-state space. A space that the state dare not move into very often. It is not an accident that this is where many of the people who have been involved in, if you've been reading about Pakistan, you know that Pakistan has been bedeviled by the problem of jihadis for the last 2 decades, Islamic insurgents, the Taliban, all of that. Where do they go? Once you launch an attack somewhere, you're on the run, you go into FATA. Right? It's a non-state space. Now, that's the relationship here with the Naxalite movement. That you see these areas, it's not that the terrain is, we're not talking about 20,000 feet, we're talking about the plains. I mean, there may be small hills here and there when we're talking about central India there. But when I say hostile, it can be hostile for any number of reasons, such as the fact that, for example, it has not been Hinduized or Christianized or Islamicized. And this area, in that sense, remains unknown to the imagination of the middle-class Indian, to the imagination of the state. The state's writ does not run very much in these parts. That was one reason why the Naxalites were able to administer parallel forms of government. They were also able to do that because the state was viewed with disdain and suspicion for all the right reasons. Because the state there is simply seen as an imposition on these people, you know, right? And you recall now, I mean, I won't obviously go over all the details once again, but I talked to you about the beginnings of the Naxalite movement, and then I mentioned to you that in 2009, so, you know, after neoliberalization policies, they also started opening up to mining interests. Then at the same time, you also started getting these revolutionary cadres coming in, so forth and so on, the creation of the Communist Party of India, Maoist, etc. In 2009, you have the UPA government, Congress-led UPA government, launching a counterinsurgency movement dubbed Operation Green Hunt. And one of the things that the state has done is it's flooded the area with security forces. I mean, how many of you honestly had heard of Bastar before this class began? But you've all heard of Afghanistan, right? In Afghanistan, there is one soldier for every 150 people. In Bastar, there's one soldier for every 55. It's 3 times as militarized, almost, as Afghanistan, but no one's ever heard of it. Huge density of security forces. And these would be, of course, various kinds. It would be the local police, it would be the state police, and it would be the Central Reserve Police Force, you know. And then, of course, you can also have other military units there as well, if needed. And if you really look at the history of the last 10 or 15 years, which has been documented extensively by human rights groups and lawyers, the Indian state will very often say, oh, these human rights groups, you know, these are all Western liberal groups. No, I'm sorry, no, these are not just Western liberal groups. These are Indian groups as well. You know, PUDER, People's Union for Democratic Rights, PUCL, People's Union for Civil Liberties, local activists, local human rights specialists, doctors, lawyers, all of whom have been working in the area and have documented it. And there is just no question that you do have enormous sexual and human rights abuses. Well, extrajudicial killings. Extrajudicial killings can be of various kinds. You know, people who actually are taken into custody and die in custody. You know, tribal people who are suspected of insurgency and therefore apprehended, and even before they can be brought to trial, might be beaten up in jail and might die in jail. Right? Killings of intellectuals, journalists, activists. But it didn't stop there. The state actually created a vigilante group. And there's a little bit of that happening, by the way, in the US, on the border. You should read about it. You should read about vigilante groups of white supremacists that have been created with the active interest of the US government and state governments in states such as Arizona. There's plenty of documentation about these vigilante groups, trying to keep out the foreigner, the immigrant. Right? But here, this is on a different scale. A vigilante group created by the state called the Salwa Judum, purification hunt. That's what the phrase means, purification hunt. You know, which of course is both the words are important here, because purification, we're going to cleanse this area. And what are we going to cleanse it? We're going to cleanse it of these Naxalites who are basically like vermin. You know, it's an infestation. And it's a hunt, because that's what the state is engaged upon, in a sense. It's a hunt. You hunt out, smoke out these people, whether they're the Adivasis themselves or whether it's their supporters, and of course the Maoist revolutionaries. Right? This was a vigilante group that was really creating havoc in this area. and of course committing extrajudicial killings. And it was very easy for the state to say, we absolve ourselves because this is not our forces, this is a local group. But that's what partly the Sundar book, and there are many other such works which have really looked at the Salwa Judum and how it came about. And finally, partly on account of the work done by human rights lawyers over several years, the Supreme Court had to outlaw it in 2011. And of course, with all of these such groups, they are reformed under a different name, different auxiliary force. Before, they used to be known as special police officers. And so the state knows how to reinvent itself as well. But there are very precise elements of counterinsurgency that we need to think about. And there is another analytical point I want to make. I mean, the problem is somewhat less acute now than it used to be before, but its problem is still there. And this problem goes back to, for example, the 19th century, 18th century, and that problem is that how do we actually discern the minds of rebels? For example, you have the Great Rebellion of 1857-58, which I had mentioned in passing when I was giving you a brief overview in week 1. Most of the documents we have about the 1857-58 rebellion are documents produced by the counter-insurgents. That is, they're produced by the state, the colonial state in this case, and its functionaries, officers who were charged with putting down the rebellion. So you're seeing that rebellion through the lens of these colonial officials. But what about the rebels themselves? Most of the rebels didn't read or write even. Many of them were illiterate. They certainly didn't leave behind written records. Now you might find an occasional diary here or there. And so for the historian, the problem becomes, how do you try to understand what is happening from the point of view of the rebel, the insurgent? Right? You have the documents of counterinsurgency. That problem is being ameliorated to a certain extent today, because now, of course, you can't block out, obviously, cyberspace, for example. So you can read about what's happening there, and then there are people who might be weighing in, who are coming in from a point of view opposed to the state. You have human rights activists in the area. And of course, many of these Maoist revolutionaries, the vanguard at least, as it's called, many of these people are educated people and theoretically savvy, some of them. Right? So the state has to deal with it, and this is what we're talking about here is counterinsurgency. How does the state respond to it? And typically, this is again something that you find in other disputes as well. You can take the minds and hearts kinds of approach. That is, you try to win the people over, and then you use all the means that available to you to persuade them of your point of view. Right. Or you can take the more extreme approach, the other extreme, which is you terrorize the population. Sometimes it may be a combination of the two. Sometimes you begin with the minds and hearts, and then you find that that's not working or it's not producing the results, then you terrorize them. Sometimes you terrorize them to begin with, and then you introduce a more softer note in how you deal with them. Right? These are different ways in which you can do with them. But if you had to look at it in practical terms, right, let's just take 3 or 4 measures so we understand how the state in India has launched retaliation against the Naxalites and the villagers. And remember that the Naxalites in that area are drawn from the ranks of the villagers to a very substantial extent. Most of them would be. It may not be that village which is being targeted, but it could be a whole series of contiguous villages. So you try to force people into parting with their land, and that could mean forcible dispossession of the land, or it could mean just simply trying to force people to sell the land at what is obviously something far below the market rate for their land. And again, there is a brief discussion of that if you go through the rest of the book. If you ever get interested, there's a greater discussion of some of these points, how people have been forced into parting with their land. then they've deployed the strategy of grouping people. And this has been done because this is an easier way to attempt to take control of the situation, to be able to regulate the local population. So she discusses this on page 17. I just want to read out a very short paragraph because, again, it shows you that this is all straight out of what you might call the Manual of Counterinsurgency. The Manual of Counterinsurgency wasn't written here. It was written decades ago, right? British-controlled Malay, 1948-60, is famous as a classic prototype of grouping. Some 570,000 Chinese were uprooted and moved into internment camps, glorified as new villages, to wean them away from the Communist Party of Malay, right? Decommunize them. The strategy was borrowed by the Americans, who created strategic hamlets in Vietnam to isolate the peasants from the Viet Cong, right? This is the guerrilla forces, and deprive the latter of supplies and information on troop movements. The process is euphemistically described as protecting the civilian population from being preyed on by insurgents, and has been deployed with devastating effects on civilian populations across the world. So straight out from the counterinsurgency manual. The rape of women. Now we do need to talk about this a bit, because this is also linked up with the segment we're going to be doing on gender in week 9. Because I think that it's not fully understood why women become so vulnerable in these kinds of situations, right? That is to say that, you see, there is a view which simply describes the rape of women as emanating from the bestiality of some men, right? And yeah, I can grant that there's some men who are bestial, or some men who are going to engage in sexual assault and criminal violence against women. But this is not what, of course, this is simply about, because one of the things that's been documented in substantial detail is women as instruments of war. You know, that researchers have been able to establish by looking at nearly every warlike situation how women become, in particular, a kind of a message that the bodies of women are really vehicles by which men pass messages from one community to the men of another community. Right? This was an argument that was advanced by an American feminist, for example, many years ago, Susan Brown Miller, when she wrote a book called Men, Women, and Rape, where she was trying to understand the politics of rape. And what she was arguing in part was that, you know, when women are raped, particularly if they're raped in numbers, okay, when you look at it as a collectivity, that what's happening here is that the men of the community to which these women belong are being told a message. A message is being conveyed to them that you are unable to protect your women. You're effeminate. It's an attack on their masculinity, to the extent that the woman sometimes becomes incidental, actually. Right? That's, in effect, something that is also happening in all of these kinds of instances. Right? Because it is striking to what extent this really plays out in all of these kinds of conflicts. I mean, in the Balkans, this was something, you know, in the conflict over the Balkans, some of you wouldn't have any recollection at all, you know, but a few of you here would. I mean, I'm talking about the conflicts 25 years ago, which were shaking up the whole Balkans, you know, and the genocides in Bosnia and all of that. documented in massive numbers, all of these. Okay? And then, of course, there's this whole, that you try to essentially ensure that people are not able to sustain a lifestyle at all. So you burn their villages, you destroy their crops. Destroying crops is destroying pretty much everything for people who are leading a rural agricultural lifestyle. You kill the livestock, right? And then, not that this is an exhaustive list, but this gives you a pretty good idea of all the measures that are used by by counterinsurgents, that is by the state. There is a whole question of territorialization, the deliberate attempt to change the demographic composition of a place. I've spoken to you about that before. I've spoken to you about it when I gave the example of China and Tibet, for example, but I've also given other instances. And this is an instance where this is unquestionably happening. This is not the most self-evident thing that's happening there, but if you look at Nandini Sundar's work, page 39, in the last few decades, many of the Adivasi areas in the country, she's not just talking about Bastar, many of the Adivasi areas, tribal areas in the country have seen significant demographic change, leading to a rapid increase in the percentage of non-tribal settlers. Okay? They occupy the bureaucracy and control trade. Inevitably, they have also slowly taken over Adivasi land, helped by the weak implementation of laws meant to protect Adivasi holdings, etc. So here is, in short, an idea about how these counterinsurgency operations have been carried out in places such as Bastar, but also other areas where there's been heavy Naxalite activity and where the state has clearly gone to war with the insurgents. All right. Any question? Because this is going to wrap up our discussion of, there's some elements of this which we address when we move into the next section here as well, when we look at workers, refugees, migrants. And what I want to do is, without comment, I want to first share with you about 10-15 slides. I just want you to sort of absorb them. 2-3 minutes, I'm going to linger over each for about 5-10 seconds. I just want you to look at these and see what's happening over here. I can only identify the activity where this, for example, may not be transparent. You can see what's happening and yet not see what's happening. Some of them I won't comment at all. What's happening here is that these are little children at a place where they do stone crushing. So when they lay out roads, so when you have huge stones, so you have to crush these stones and put them as part of the gravel, right, on a road. And this is that's what you're seeing over there is these stones. They have machines for stone crushing, but very often they'll use human labor for it, as well. Okay, so that's where you see these 4 children at one of these places where they have this stone crushing. They're not doing the stone crushing, they're just actually, because then you have to pick up these small pieces of stone and then carry them or to wherever they're needed. Very often they'll have a chain of people, so you fill up the basket, pass it from one hand to another. Okay, so remember that we are now looking at the whole question of laborers, working class history, migrants, refugees. Okay, this is one of the larger pieces of stone which this young girl is got on her head. This you can probably make out, coal, right? As in other countries, there has been a debate about the use of coal, trying to minimize it, but India still does have a substantial percentage of reliance on coal. So we'll talk about these. You just take a look at them. Okay. So, before I begin, does anybody have any, you've seen a range of images, anything that strikes anyone in particular?
There's a significant number of child labor, despite the child labor laws that were passed.
Yes, that's unquestionably the case.
Yeah.
Significant number of children. I think by now you should know that India has very progressive legislation on the question of the abolition of use of child labor. Yeah? Yes?
Unsafe working conditions?
Sorry, I didn't hear it.
Unsafe working conditions?
Unsafe working conditions. Absolutely. And that could be documented in nearly every slide probably, right? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so labor intensive, right? Yes. Although some of that work would, yeah, I mean, you're right, you're right. But there'll be areas where it would have to be labor intensive, and then other areas where you don't need to. For example, going into a sewer to clean it out, maybe it could be done by machinery, which it is done in many countries, but here it's not. Yeah, so we've got three different things. So fundamentally, yes, you're right. Yeah.
There's a lot of polluted areas, or has to do with trash or unsanitary places.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
The images of people on pulling
Hand rickshaws. Hand rickshaws. Yeah.
It clearly depicts inequality.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So the use of hand rickshaws is something that you find only, and actually even there it's not really allowed. I mean, there's been a bit of in Calcutta. But there are no hand rickshaws in use in Bombay or Delhi, and haven't been for a long period of time. You do have cycle rickshaws, which you did see, and you also have motorized rickshaws. But yes, but the inequality, I mean, this is already a comment on inequality. Yeah, I mean, unquestionably, even if you don't see it in the way in which it's transparently the case, because one man is pulling someone else. So there, it's more evident in that sense. Anyone else had their hand up? One more Shivang.
Yeah, so I guess just going along with those lines, that image of the rickshawala,
yeah,
pretty much shoulder deep in water.
Yes.
And he's pulling that guy, and his passenger is just completely indifferent to the situation.
This one here.
Yeah, this guy
yeah.
It just struck me
right.
This guy's just not even recognizing what.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it could be a colonial era picture. If you had to put it in a different way, you could. Of course, it's also a comment on what happens when the monsoons come down. I have always commented that what do you call it? The drainage system in the Indus Valley civilization that is 4,000 years ago, was superior to the drainage system in India today. If the archaeological digs that they have done of the Indus Valley civilization show what appears to be a very extensive drainage system in places like Mohenjo-daro. And I suspect that many of these skills over centuries became diminished, if I may put it this way. So much for the story of progress. Yeah, and we keep on going up the inclined plane of history. But yeah, anyhow, all these Indian cities are woefully unprepared for monsoon rains. And so this picture is a commentary on other things as well, besides what you've already mentioned. All right. So you think about the images, but let me begin on a different discursive level here. because this segment, as I've said to you, is a segment where we're thinking about workers, migrants, refugees. And when I say refugees, I don't mean it in the sense in which it's meant in the United States today when you speak about refugees coming in, because that's a minuscule portion of the population. I'm using refugees in the wider sense, although India does have refugee populations. For example, there's a whole Afghan refugee population in India. In New Delhi has significant Tibetan refugee populations. There are actually groups of that kind, so there is a refugee population. And when I think of refugees, I don't mean it only in that sense. I'm also thinking about internal refugees, and I'm thinking about people who are seeking refuge, as it were, in different ways. And of course, I think in order to start looking at this, so it's going to be a series of wide-ranging comments, because obviously the labor history of India is not something that we're going to take on in any substantive sense of the term. But I want to highlight some features which would help us understand contemporary India and contemporary South Asia more generally, because many of the arguments I'm advancing here could be easily advanced apropos of Pakistan and Bangladesh. Nepal less so, because Nepal doesn't really have the great metropolitan centers. I mean, it's got a city like Kathmandu, but you can't compare Kathmandu to Delhi or Bombay, obviously. So certainly, if you're looking at Bangladesh and Pakistan, what I'm saying here would be true of these two countries as well. And one of the things that you do find in these countries, and then I'll go back to the prior question of what is work, what is labor, is the massive migration from the countryside to the cities. It is really one of the most striking aspects of the history of post-1947 South Asia, is the migration from the hinterland, from the countryside to the cities. I think I gave you the numbers for Delhi, I remember that. That in 1941, Delhi had 400,000 people. So the last census before partition, before the end of British rule. And today it's 21 million, right? Astronomical. I mean, of course, this growth of cities has been a feature of many countries. But, New York and Chicago and LA did not grow at those rates, not even remotely close to those rates. That's what we're speaking about. Of course, Delhi was really an exception, because Bombay, later now known as Mumbai, had a substantial population, but even there the population increase has been dramatic, but nothing as dramatic as Delhi. And there are places that have just arisen out of nothing, literally, in 20-25 years. A place such as Gurgaon, which is a satellite city, you might say. It's on the outskirts of Delhi, so it's not actually part of Delhi, although it's considered part of what is called the capital territory region. Okay, and Gurgaon really did not even exist 20-25 years ago. And if you go there today, what you're going to see in Gurgaon is a mass of, skyscrapers. It's one of the places where a lot of American companies do their, back office work. Okay, back office work, call workers and all of that. So this is a mall in Gurgaon. It's about 1 kilometer from where I have a home in that part of the capital region. All right. So this is the sort of thing that's happened there. This could be anywhere in the world. It could be in the U.S., in Europe, in Malaysia, in PRC, you name it, right? These kinds of malls, which are pretty much generic now, but it didn't even exist 25 years ago. I mean, it existed as a village, and you can see it actually on a map of the 19th century as some small, obscure little village, and then within 25 years, and now it's got a population of something like 2 million that we're talking about, Gurgaon alone. Okay, right? So this has been one of the major changes. And where are all these people coming from? They're coming from actually the hinterland very often, from the countryside. And there is a pet theory. The pet theory is that they're fleeing the countryside, and theory is not incorrect, but when I say pet theory, it means that it's also obscuring a few other things. But that pet theory is that, of course, these people are fleeing the countryside because the countryside is no longer able to offer any livelihood. And certainly, if you remember the whole discussion I had with you about the crisis of Indian agriculture, farmer suicides, there is reason to believe that that is, in fact, one of the principal reasons why these people have been fleeing the countryside, emptying out the farms. That's not the only reason why people leave, though, and that's what I mean by the pet theory, that it's obscuring things. For example, one of the reasons why they flee the countryside is because in the countryside you cannot escape your past. You cannot escape who you are. You cannot escape your identity. And so if you're looking to actually embrace a new identity in some sense, give yourself a different kind of future, not just employment-wise, though. Okay, then you move to the city, because the city is the place of anonymity. Millions of people, and there'll be situations in which your caste doesn't matter. Fundamentally, it may not matter. I don't, however, want you to take the view that urbanization necessarily equals liberalization of thought. That is, not necessarily. One should be wary of that kind of connection. But this has been one of the fundamental changes, I think, in India. I think the best avenue into that is the Hindi film. And that's one reason why we're going to spend a week on the Hindi film as well, is because we want to understand how the Hindi film, the commercial Bollywood film, is able to really do that. Okay? And the scale, as I've said, is really, really quite enormous. The last census is the first census which shows that the rate of growth in cities, rate of growth of population in cities, is now outstripping the rate of growth in rural areas. Right? The 2011 census is the first census to show that. It is also necessary to add, when we're looking at it, to look at some mega elements first. It's also necessary to understand that there is a considerable Indian labor, which has gone overseas. And I want to show you this over here, because this is very surprising, except to people who have studied sort of the Indian diaspora, or who have some sense in India. There is some recognition of this, but on the whole there wouldn't be. So these are remittances to India. So that is money that is being sent, because you know that for many countries such as India, remittances, this is true of China as well, for example, remittances from overseas have been an important source for boosting the economy. I don't have a chart here, but I can tell you what the figures are. In 1990-91, remittances from Indians back home to India were $2 billion in 1990-91. In the year 2017, it was $83 billion, right? $83 billion, so an increase of over 40 times from, and of course in comparison to, let's say, 1950, when there were virtually no remittances at all, virtually none. Yeah, right? So this is a major source, and you've got, obviously, because when we're talking about migrants, we're not talking only about migrants within India, people moving from one city to another, which is one kind of migration, and people moving from the countryside, but we're also talking about Indians who have actually been moving overseas. And this is what is surprising here, is that the largest source of remittances is not the United States. Right? The U.S. has 4 million Indians. 4 million people of Indian origin are living in the United States today. Right? So a little over 1% of the population of this country. And it is by far the wealthiest segment, by far the wealthiest segment. But the remittances going from UAE, the United Arab Emirates, are higher than the remittances coming from the United States. And you can see number 3 is Saudi Arabia. Yes?
I'm kind of shocked that China isn't on there.
Sorry?
I'm kind of shocked that China isn't on I was under the impression that there was an awful lot more migration going from India to China these days. So I'm surprised it's not. I'm just like saying.
No. You're not going to. You can go down the list. This is the top 10. No, you don't have. There are Indians who are going to China for business. Okay, these people are sending remittances because they're living in these countries. They're living in these countries. The Indians who are living in UAE don't have citizenship because it's almost impossible to get citizenship in the United Arab Emirates, in places like Abu Dhabi, Dubai, all of the Gulf states, for example, almost impossible. Large number of Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis. This is one place where they meet, by the way. The Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis, other than the campuses of American universities, is places like UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, because you have a large number of these people going there. Many of them have gone there to... These countries have been really built by South Asian labor. All these mega projects in these places, including the overseas branch of the Louvre, the museum, right? And the tallest tower in the world, and this and that, and these gigantic amusement parks. I'm even told there's one underneath the sea or something. I don't know what it is. Some bizarre, surreal things. It's South Asian labor that has really built all of this. Most of these South Asians, their passports are usually taken by them unless they belong to the more elite, because even the doctors, the engineers, they're virtually all of them South Asian. Okay, but I'm talking about a huge laboring class that has built the highways, malls, supermarkets, the banks, the financial institutions, the skyscrapers, all of that. Right? So this is where the remittances are coming from. And we would have to, if you were really looking, and you might say, well, that's now taking us outside the history of India. No, it's not. I'll tell you why. Okay? And this, we go back to this slide over here. So that's why I wanted to give you transformations in the Kerala countryside. So you know where Kerala is by now, of course, state down in South India, southwest. Now, if you go to the countryside in Kerala, the most dramatic change, and this has implications for the politics in Kerala now. The most dramatic change is because there's been a huge labor force from Kerala, which has gone to the Gulf, all right? Many of these people, they send money back. That's the remittances. And a lot of that money has been used to build mosques in the countryside. So suddenly you're going in this, these really rural area where there were always mosques before, and there were temples, Hindu temples, because Kerala is very mixed. Right? It has a substantial population of Hindus and Muslims and Christians. Very mixed, so you would see these. But now what you see is these huge gleaming mosques, and always in green, right? Because that's a color, right, that they use in Islam, green. Yeah, huge buildings. And what it's doing is it's altering the nature of the countryside. I don't mean it's just altering the landscape, the physical landscape. It's altering the cultural landscape. Many of these mosques are also essentially bringing in Wahhabi ideology. This is a relationship, that it's no longer going to be possible to understand some of what's happening in South Asia unless we're able to understand some of these wider connections that are being forged not only by religious ideologues but by labor, a laboring class, right? And that's the significance of trying to understand it, that when we're looking at the question of labor and working class history, and of course there is a prior question, why are all of these people going? They're going there because there's not enough work that's being generated for them in India. Or if it is being generated, it certainly does not pay the kind of money that work is going to be paid in places like Abu Dhabi, Dubai, It's I mean, frankly, in the sense, if you had to think of an analogy, since you're located here, it's not dramatically different from a large number of people coming in from Mexico or Central America to work here. You know, if you go to the wealthy areas, and many of these areas have housekeepers, and the housekeepers are almost always Hispanic, and they're coming from these different countries, and then you find that many of them have families back in Guatemala or El Salvador or Nicaragua, Mexico. Right? The situation is not that different in that sense. So these are some questions. However, let's go back now to the primary question first. What is work? What is labor? Why are certain kinds of work valued and other kinds of work that is not valued? And that has ethical, political, social dimensions, which we're not getting into now. But I think clearly every country adopts a certain kind of thinking about this. Right? And there may be some things that are common in how countries think about it, because, for example, I think if you're a neurosurgeon, you're going to be paid well no matter where you are, whether you're in India or Bangladesh or the United States. And if you're a sanitation worker, you're not going to be paid well in most countries. Doesn't matter where you are. Right? I think that would be a safe thing to say. I think it would be a safe thing to say, for example, that domestic work is undervalued probably almost everywhere. Yes, I know that there are places such as Iceland and Finland where the situation may be a little bit different, but I'm saying if you look at it in the totality of things, it seems to me that there is a kind of a common sense that has developed around it. This common sense may have to be questioned about why some work is valued and others isn't. And of course it is intrinsic, this way of thinking, to what is happening in India, that work is in other words, that you see people just assume that it's because of caste. And you see the interpretive move I'm making here. I'm saying it's not just caste, because this has become part of the common sense of every culture. If you can point to me any single illustration of a neurosurgeon or even a banker getting paid less than a sanitation worker in this country or a housekeeper, I'd love to hear about it. Where does caste come into it? It doesn't. It will come into the picture, and then we'll have to try. So what we have to do is we may have to disaggregate a number of different things. That when we're looking at the history of the working class, we can't assume that we're going to be able to explain this through timeless social structures, allegedly as they're called, that have obtained in India for a long period of time. Some of it may factor in, and some of it may not factor in. The similar considerations come into the picture when you think about the gender division of labor. Because if you read those articles on manual scavenging, that 23-page, you notice that even there's a gender division of labor, even within that. That certain kinds of toilets are going to be cleaned by women, and the people who go into the sewers are all men. Not a single woman does that. Not a single woman has been documented, actually, as far as I'm aware of. It's all men. So even there you have the gendered division of labor when we think about this kind of work. And it is work. It is work. It should be recognized as work. And of course, much of this, but not all of it. Here's the other mistake. The assumption sometimes is that all of these people belong to the informal labor economy. Now, if you read that 4-part series, you know that that's not the case. That not all of them belong. In fact, some of these are people who are actually working as government employees with regular salaries. And a couple of the people who were interviewed say that, this is one reason we stick to the job, because, if in India you have a government job, it's almost impossible to get fired. Almost impossible. Which is why people will take a government job even if it's at a salary which is below what you would get at the market rate. Almost impossible to get fired from a government. It's as secure as a university tenured professorship here, okay? I mean, unless I go about throwing a bomb or sexually assaulting women, Yeah, I just cannot be dismissed from my position, you know. Okay. It's really, it's very interesting because, as I said, the assumption is these are all informal. No. This is, many of these people actually are part of the formal economy. They're government contracts, government salaries, and in some cases these may be desired jobs. So this is why I assigned this particular, you know, series of articles, because otherwise it looks very dry. But then when you start reading it, things that which are really quite extraordinary that are really happening here, you know. All right, and this is apart from, I think, as I said, larger questions which I'm not entertaining at the moment here, which have to do with obviously how, as I've suggested to you, how we think of work and how we think of labor, and why is it that although there are people who specialize in labor history, as it's called, it's a field, that generally labor history is not included within the ambit of history courses. Very often you have to do a specialized course in labor history to really hear about what the working class are doing and how they make their living and how does one enter their worldview. And that's one of the reasons I assigned that novel as well, because it's one way to enter into the worldview of these people who are working in the kitchen or as domestic workers and so on. All right? And it is also important to understand that I think this is a middle class view, but I'm generally, I think, quite disdainful of middle class views about most things. Okay, but this middle class view I agree with, except that I read it in a different way, which is that I think there is something called a work ethos, and I don't think it exists for the most part in India. Okay, I'm not convinced that it ought to exist. That's the difference that I have with the middle class reading, because you see, if you look at the Indian middle class, you know, the general view always is, yeah, you know, these people, they don't work. That's why they don't progress. Of course, this goes back to the colonial times. You know, it's called the myth of the lazy native. That's the trope. You know, the native never works. Right? They don't know how to make their lives more productive. The question is that maybe these people haven't yet fully caught on to the so-called charms of being productive. You know? I mean, if you're working 3-4 hours a day, which is what many of these people are doing, government jobs definitely not more than 3 hours, I would say. If all the Indian government offices I've known, if anyone works more than 3 hours, except the people at the very top wearing suits and ties in India and going from one meeting to another, which is what people in suits and ties usually do, go from one meeting to another. Other than that, no one is working more than 3 or 4 hours. And then if you read the newspapers or if you take part in common everyday conversations, they're all grumbling about the lack of this work ethos. You know? Now, I think that's true. There isn't any, because I think it has to be instilled in people. And India is fundamentally an anarchic country, fundamentally anarchic in every sense of the term. And that also means that it's difficult to instill these kinds of ideas, because these are ideas that are instilled over generations, and you have to be, essentially, there has to be a regime of thought which has to be directed at you, you know, okay? I mean, you'd have to put every Indian in what the Chinese call a re-education camp for a whole generation to turn them into model citizens, you see, right? That's what you'd have to do. And this is essentially one way to describe sort of the work situation. You know, it used to be when I mean, I heard this from my parents and from my grandparents, and then I saw it in my generation, and my children hear it from me. You know, if you ever went to an Indian bank, Indian banks used to be all state-owned until relatively recent years, because Mrs. Gandhi had nationalized the banks. And then state banks only came up in, private banks only came up in the last couple of decades, really. So, you know, you went to a bank, you wanted a transaction done. There was a stock answer. It was like he had turned on the tape recorder, the clerk. Aapka la jana, you come tomorrow. It's like, why? I'm here right now. Do the work. No, you come tomorrow. You know, it was a standard thing. You know. So this is what I mean when I say that, yes, I agree that there is no work ethos here, but this idea that we are fundamentally working creatures, this is a European invention of the 18th century. You know, I mean, it's a maddening idea, frankly, why everyone should become a slave to something called work their whole life. I've got to hear a really good reason for why that should be the case. But the chairman of this huge Chinese company, Alibaba, you know, the Amazon of China, I mean, the most recent pronouncement he said was, I don't see why the Chinese are working only 12 hours a day. They ought to be working 16 hours a day. That's what he said. You know? You know? So this is what you have to keep in mind. That there is this, that's the regime. And this regime is, in a sense, being defied in India every day. These are different forms of resistance, and people don't show up at work, or they say you come. It is laziness perhaps, but there are other things there too. That's what I'm trying to suggest. We'd have to complicate the picture of this, okay? And on this here, the last thing, because this is where everyone gets sentimental or angry, which is the use of child labor in India. There's plenty of use of child labor. It's a complicated question. You know, you keep a housekeeper or a maid. I mean, of course, child labor is more prevalent, by the way, in rural areas, because in many of these farms, the children will work with their parents. And the children that you see on the streets in India, in the urban areas, at these work sites, these are all women or men who have come from the countryside. All right. So, you know, in this photograph over here, you can almost be certain that their mothers or fathers are somewhere close by, and they've probably come from the countryside, and the children, of course, are not going to school, even though, you guessed it, there is legislation in India which says that you have to send your child to school and all of that. There is a right to free education, right? There is a right to free education in India. And of course, all of the state-run schools are in absolute shambles. You know, the vast majority of them are in absolute shambles. If you read the Amartya Sen reading from a few weeks ago, you would have remembered the Uncertain Glory book that you had, where you know, they talk about people who have gone to these schools, teachers don't show up, 100 children, only one classroom, the walls are peeling, you know, and this is even true at the universities. Forget about these little countries, small rural schools that we're really talking about. And it's difficult, of course, because in many of these areas, the argument is that the livelihood is already so scarce in the rural areas that the children bring in a little bit extra money. Usually when children are working at the labor site, it's almost always at a lower wage. So there is a hierarchy of wages, and men will generally get paid more for the same kind of work than the women, and then the women will get paid more than the children. Generally, that's how it's going to work. You know, unless it happens to be a job that is going to be occupied entirely by women, in which case usually, as is the case in the US, the wages are usually set lower than they are. So which is why, for example, you know, kindergarten teachers are going to be paid at a lower rate. You're going to find out in most countries. All right. So these considerations will definitely apply. Where this becomes a problem is, of course, that they're not having any schooling at all, right? There is a critique of institutionalized schooling. That's a different critique at a different meta level, because here we're talking about the fact that these people are not even going to pick up elementary and rudimentary skills of literacy, you know, elementary forms of writing and reading at all. And then, of course, you have somebody here had commented when I showed the slides, unsafe working conditions. So that's a fundamental problem, because there are guidelines, but these guidelines are almost never observed. And you will see that even the people who are going down into the sewer, you know, to clean it out, they are not being given masks. There is a law which says you have to be given masks, you have to be given gloves, all of that. Very often these laws are not really followed. So it's not as though the laws aren't there, but it's a problem that we have really encountered below. And of course, India is signatory to all the international protocols which have to do with the abolition of child labor. All right. Now, I want to just take a few more minutes, and then we'll wrap up. I'll say a little bit more about these things in my next lecture, but I want to just go back to a couple of the slides, and then in my next lecture, I'm going to take up a little bit more about manual scavenging and Dalits, and look at some of those readings as well. But I just want to take a minute or two to quickly look at a couple of these slides, which is, number one, these are rag pickers, as I think you can infer from the photograph, this one and this one as well. And I think it's important to understand many of these children are children who have run away from their homes. Particularly rag pickers, it's been shown, especially children. They tend to be children who have run away from their homes, and very often the easiest way to run away in India is you sit on one of these trains and you travel ticketless, and the next thing you know, 3 days later, you're at the other end of the country. It is also the case that rag picking is controlled by mafias. Okay, this is a big business. Sorting out the garbage. Sometimes you might find something, its disposal is a problem. There is a political geopolitics. There's a geopolitics of garbage disposal. You might have read recently that there are countries which have said that they're going to now turn back all ships coming from countries such as the United States and Canada carrying garbage. They're not going to accept it anymore. So there's a larger question of global political economy, I should say. But apart from this being run by the mafia, rag picking operations, very often families get an informal kind of contract, and the contract passes down from the father to the son. So this is an illustration of that. If the picture is attached to an article, you read the article, you find out that this boy's father's been doing the same thing, and basically the mafia has assigned a certain portion of one garbage dump, and you say this is yours, and the same family will continue to do it, and they might sublet it, by the way, the work to somebody else, and extract a commission. All right, so all of these things have their own political economy, but I'll stop here, and then I'll pick up on Tuesday from here.